Peace be upon you. So oftentimes when debating with traditionalists regarding the authenticity of Hadith, they bring up this concept of mutawatir Hadith. Mutawatir are Hadith that they claim are so vastly mass transmitted that it becomes impossible for these to be fabrications or lies. And these are considered the gold standard of authenticity, and they claim that these mutawatir Hadith provide epistemological certainty. But is this really what we find? When we dig into this concept surrounding mutawatir hadith, we find that it's far from absolute. While the Sunnis claim that these traditions are theoretically framed as being above dispute due to their widespread transmission, the reality is riddled with significant disagreement among Sunni scholars about their validity, their application, and even if they're even considered as mutawatir. These fractures expose the fragility of the claim that tawatur guarantees universal acceptance or certainty. So for background, the concept of mutawatir is rooted in epistemology. How do you know something is true? And this refers to a type of report or transmission that is so widely narrated by a large number of people across different times and places that they claim it becomes inconceivable for it to be fabricated or false. And this concept of mutawatir, mass transmission, it actually predates Islamic historiography and can be traced back to classical epistemological discussions in ancient Greece and Roman traditions, where a consensus of testimonies was considered a reliable source of historical and factual knowledge. This is what we call probabilistic knowledge. In Islamic thought, the term mutawatir became significant during the development of hadith sciences. So Sunni Muslim scholars tasked with authenticating reports attributed to the Prophet sought to categorize hadith into varying levels of reliability. Sunni compilers of hadith like Suyuti and others employed the concept of mutawatir to bolster the authenticity of key traditions that they thought were important within the corpus. Now the problem with the term mutawatir is that it's disjoined from what it originally meant. Originally, for something to be tawatur, it required an unbroken chain of transmission involving a large number of narrators in every step of the chain. Yet no hadith meets this requirement. Early Islamic scholars grappled with the difficulty of meeting this rigorous standard. According to classical epistemology, for a report to qualify as mutawatir, the number of transmitters had to be so vast and geographically diverse that any possibility of collusion or fabrication was inconceivable. Yet this high bar was unattainable for any hadith in the entire corpus. As Jonathan Brown notes in his book, Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World, it reads, "The categories of mutawatir and ahad were similarly unsuitable for the hadith tradition, for essentially all hadiths were ahad. As Ibn al-Saleh, the most famous scholar of hadith criticism in the later period, explained, at most one hadith, whoever lies about me, let him prepare for himself a seat in hellfire, would meet the requirements for mutawatir. No hadith could actually be described as being narrated by a large number of narrators at every stage of their transmission. In fact, when Mu'tazilites had insisted that hadiths be transmitted by a mere 2 people at every stage, the Sunni Ibn Hibban had accused them of trying to destroy the Sunnah of the Prophet in its entirety. So to summarize this paragraph, it's stating that no hadith in the entire corpus is actually mutawatir, that they're all ahad. Now what's interesting is Ibn Salah, he cites one hadith that he says this could potentially be meeting the requirements of mutawatir, which is whoever lies about me, let him prepare for himself a seat in the hellfire. Ironically, even the sole hadith mentioned, which could possibly meet this requirement of mutawatir, is inconsistent both in wording and in meaning, as there are debates about whether the lie had to be deliberate or not. And we talked about this in other episodes. So if you look at these hadith regarding this one sentence, A good number of the narrations claim that anyone who lies about me will have their seat in the hell, while the other set uses the term deliberately lies about me. So not only is the wording different, but the outcome of how we understand this would be different, because if the lie was general, irrespective if it was intentional or not, or it had to be deliberate, this would be the end of all hadith narrations, because none of the narrations are considered to be the verbatim statement of the Prophet. So for example, in the same book on page 24, it says the companion Wathila bin Asqa had admitted that sometimes the early Muslims even confused the exact wording of the Quran, which was universally well known and well preserved. So how, he asked, could one expect any less in the case of a report, hadith, that the Prophet had just said once? Al-Hasan al-Basri is reported to have said, if we only narrated to you what we could repeat word for word, we would only narrate 2 hadiths. So this is looking really bad for the hadith corpus. Not only are no hadith genuinely mutawatir, but no hadith is actually a verbatim statement from the Prophet. And according to the book, Tawatur in Islamic Thought by Suhail Lahar, on page 62, it reads, Abu Ali al-Juba and Abu Hashim al-Juba held that no narrations other than the Quran reach Tawatur. Ibn Hibban categorically denies the existence of any mutawatir hadith. Al-Hazimi and Ibn Abi al-Dam say that it would be difficult to find a hadith satisfying the criteria of tawatur. Similar skeptical sentiments were expressed by Ibn Saleh and gained wide currency through his celebrated manual, the Muqaddamah. Even al-Shafi, one of the most influential scholars, the founder of the Shafi madhab, says that there are no hadith that are narrated independently in 4 different cities for which the narrators successively fan out in each generation. The simple truth remains that no hadith beyond the Quran is truly mass-transmitted mutawatir. This is because genuinely mass-transmitted information does not necessitate facilitating a chain of transmitters, an isnad. A chain is only required when the reliability of the information is not self-evident or universally known. So for example, if someone claims that George Washington was the first president of the United States, no one requires a chain of transmitters to validate that information. We don't ask, hey, where's your isnad for that? This is generally accepted, universally mass transmitted. But hadith, because they require an isnad, because they require a chain of transmitters, it shows that they are not genuinely mass transmitted. That these are something that people are trying to prove the authenticity by saying, look, listen to the credibility of these narrators. So by definition, any hadith that requires an isnad to prove its authenticity is not mutawatir if it requires an isnad. And this takes us to another point. Individuals who think that the reason we know the authenticity of the Quran is due to the isnad, this is just false. The notion of attributing an isnad, a chain of transmission, to the Quran itself was not a concern in the early centuries of Islam. The practice of attributing an isnad to the recitation of the Quran came as the development of Sunni Islam increased. In the earliest period, the Quran was regarded as the divine revelation transmitted directly to the Prophet Muhammad and preserved through a combination of oral recitation and early written documentation. Its authority was considered self-evident, as it was distinct from the hadith corpus and being mass transmitted, as well as being divinely guaranteed to be preserved by God. Individuals actually thought that this would be a insult to the Quran to associate an isnad with it, because that's not where the credibility came. Consider, this text was memorized in part or by whole by every single practicing Muslim since its revelation, which is not the case in the context of hadith. Consequently, the earliest believers saw no need to provide an isnad for the Quran as they did for the hadith. It was not until the 4th century Hijri, you're talking about 10th century Common Era, that an isnad for the Quran was retroactively introduced, reflecting the understanding among early Muslims that the Quran, as the most widely circulated and meticulously preserved text in the history, required no additional proof of its authenticity. The individual who's attributed with standardization of the 7 eponymous readings of the Quran was Ibn Mujahid, who died in the year 936 Common Era. His seminal work, Kitab al-Saba fi al-Qira'at, the Book of the 7 Readings, established a framework for standardizing 7 reciters of the Quran and deeming these recitations as valid. In the book by Shadi Nasser titled The Second Canonization of the Quran, he writes the following regarding Ibn Mujahid. It says, when Ibn Mujahid embarked on the project of collecting the 7 eponymous readings, the community of the Gora, these are people who recite the Quran, tried to emulate the system of isnad, authentication developed by the muhaddithun. So these are the people who obviously collect and recite and compile the Hadith. So Ibn Mujahid's documentation of the isnad transmissions for the 7 readers did not establish a continuous link to the Prophet. Instead, Ibn Mujahid's chain stopped at the readers, the 7 eponymous readers. The Persian Sunni scholar Al-Tabari, a contemporary of Ibn Mujahid, did a similar work during this time. In his work, Tafsir Al-Tabari, he only attributed the variant Quranic readings to its regional Qura communities, so the communities of its recitation, rather than to specific individuals. Likely aware of the weak isnad documentation for these readings, he refrained from integrating them authoritatively in his Quranic commentary. So Tabari didn't even include a chain of narration back to any individual. He just refers it back to the geographic location, the city by which he got the reading from. It wasn't until Ibn Mahram, so you're talking about the year 992 CE is when he passed, who developed a complete isnad that linked each reading directly to the Prophet, though some connections, such as Ibn Kathir to Ubay bin Ka'b, remained indirect. So he attempted to create an isnad back to the Prophet. On page 115 of Nasser's book, it reads, Ibn Mahran, in his 88-page documentation of the chains of transmission of the 10 readings, connected each one of them directly to the Prophet through a continuous uninterrupted isnad, unlike Ibn Mujahid, whose isnad documentation stopped at the eponymous readers, after which he listed possible connections between each reader and the Prophet. So we can consider the isnad associated to the Quran more of a decorative piece without much legitimacy. And consider this. Not only were these isnads first created in the 10th century, but they often they don't go back to the Prophet. They go back to some region or one of these the eponymous readers. And there's a problem with this, where you'll have numerous individuals tying the isnad back to some companion, but then the challenge is that their recitations vary from one another. So for instance, if we take the readings from Nafi, Ibn Kathir, Abu Amr, and others, they claim lineage back to the same companion, Ubay bin Ka'b, yet their recitations vary. This inconsistency suggests that these readings were not simply preserved intact from an original source. Rather, the differences could be attributed to variations in transmission, interpretive practices, individual reasoning, ijtihad, or other regional influences. So again, this whole concept of a isnad for the Quran, this is something that was concocted many years later. It doesn't hold any validity, and they've done it more for decorative reasoning, to the point that, for hundreds of years, people actually considered it an insult to add an isnad to the Quran, because the Quran is genuinely mass transmitted, unlike the Hadith. So if no Hadith meets the requirement of mutawatir, why is it they claim there's so many Hadith that are mutawatir? To address the challenge that none of the Hadith could meet the strict classical definitions of tawatur, scholars introduced more lenient standards for what they deemed constituted as tawatur. It's like shortening a marathon from the standard 26.2 miles to just 10 miles and still insisting on calling it a marathon. This is what they did with the concept of mutawatir. They redefined the terms to make it achievable for some hadith to be able to meet that requirement. However, even this approach was inherently flawed, as there was no consensus among scholars on what these watered-down requirements should be. So on page 21 of Tawatur in Islamic Thought, it reads, Abdul Hudayl al-Alaf, who stipulated as a requirement for accepting hadiths of theological content a minimum of 20 narrators based on Surah 8, verse 65, one of whom must be the people of paradise, a friend of God. The number was later dropped to 5 by another early mutakalim, a rational theologian. There's also another quote attributed to Yahya bin Ma'in, who's a hadith master, and he's reported to have said, "Unless we write down a hadith from 30 channels, we do not understand it properly." So he's setting the requirement quite high, saying that unless we even have 30 channels, we're not going to possibly be able to understand the full context. In Lahar's book on page 89, it continues. It says, there was some discussion over how many narrators are needed to constitute tawatur. And works in legal theory often mention various opinions that fix a specific number. Some of these hark back to early theological discussions. For instance, Al-Jassas and Al-Baqlani refer to Abdul Hudayla's view that 20 impeccable narrators are needed. Others draw on scriptural texts or significant historical events that involve a specific number, but all these lack any explicit connection to the concept of tawatur, and as a result were discarded. The number 4 figures prominently for a different reason, namely, because it is the highest number of legal witnesses specified in the Quran, and yet it is undisputed that a judge can act on their testimony even though the possibilities of error and collusion are not ruled out. Hence, most legal theoreticians agree that tawatur definitively requires more than 4, with some opting that 5 narrators are sufficient. The Iraqi Shafi al-Istakari chose 10 on a linguistic basis because it is a minimum number for a plural or of plenty. And Suyuti later adopts this as the basis for his compilation of mutawatir hadiths. The general consensus that eventually emerged was that the minimum number of narrators for tawatur is limited but cannot be known. Rather, once it is realized that knowledge has accrued, then this implies that a sufficient number has been reached. Even then, al-Baqlani explains the number cannot be pinned down because of the possibility that one or more of the narrators was narrating from imitation or speculation rather than his own knowledge. So this is indicating that no one can pin down what is the requirement for mutawatir. So not only did they water down the definition, it's pretty much, hey, it's mutawatir if I claim it's mutawatir. There is no consensus. There is no objectionable criteria for what they deem as mutawatir. It's just the fact that, hey, this scholar claims that it's mutawatir. Why is it mutawatir? Because he says so. Ironically, in the efforts to establish tawatur as a definitive standard of certainty, the scholars themselves remained uncertain about its precise definition, resulting in varying thresholds and divergent lists of hadith classified as mutawatir. So if we look, someone like Ibn Salah that we discussed earlier, he considered only one hadith possibly mutawatir. Suyuti says 112 hadith are mutawatir. Salah ibn Mahdi, who died in the year 1696, 200 years after Suyuti, upped that number to 156, and Muhammad ibn Jafar al-Qatani, he increased that number into 310 mutawatir hadith, and he died in the year 1927. So it seems like each generation is finding more and more excuses to make hadith mutawatir. This scholarly attempt to bolster the status of mutawatir hadith by redefining their requirements is reminiscent of what we saw of the practices that led to the financial crisis in 2008. In that crisis, banks and financial institutions packaged subprime loans, high-risk mortgages that did not meet the strict requirement of AAA-rated investments into complex securities. These were then stamped with AAA ratings, creating the illusion of financial stability and low risk. Much like how scholars diluted the criteria for tawatur to legitimize hadith that could not meet the classical definition, these institutions lowered the bar for what was qualified as secure investment. Both approaches relied on repackaging something that fell short of established standards, that was subpar, to create the facade of reliability. just as the subprime securities eventually unraveled, revealing the underlying fragility and leading to a global financial collapse. The inconsistencies in the application of tawatur standards exposes the fragility of the claim that such hadith offer epistemological certainty. So as more and more people learn about the facade of hadith sciences, this thing is a house of cards. It's going to collapse. It's inevitable. And as the Quran states, the truth will prevail and the falsehood will vanish. The falsehood will inevitably vanish. So let's keep going. So not only are there disagreements to which hadith are deemed mutawatir, but various Sunnis will even reject hadith that are categorized as mutawatir under their more flexible standards. And a famous example of this is the blasphemous hadith narration regarding the satanic verses, that they say that the Prophet Muhammad was duped by the devil to recite satanic verses, acknowledging the pagan Meccan gods, Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, as intercessors whose testimony will be accepted. And only according to the hadith, he retracted them, and this is known as the satanic verses. This account appears in numerous early hadith sources, including the works of Tabari ibn Asal, and is narrated around 15 different versions with variations in details, and some of the chains that are actually deemed authentic as Sahih. For example, Ibn Taymiyyah states in Majmu al-Fatwa, the early Islamic scholars, Salaf, collectively considered the verses of the Quran, these are the satanic verses, in accordance with Quran. And from the later coming scholars, Khalaf, who followed the opinion of early scholars, they say that these traditions have been recorded with authentic chain of narration, and it's impossible to deny them, and Quran is itself testifying it. So while early Sunni scholars and historians generally accepted this hadith, that the Prophet received satanic verses, and they treated this as authentic, and attributed verses like 22:52, where it says that the devil is going to interfere with the prophet's wishes, but that God is going to fix what the devil throws in, that this was justification for such an event. However, modern Sunni scholars, on the other hand, overwhelmingly reject the account. These later scholars argued that this narration conflicts with the Quranic doctrine of the prophet's infallibility, isma, in matters of revelation. The shift reflects theological concerns about safeguarding the integrity of the Quran and the prophet's status as a divinely guided messenger. So while the earlier Salaf, they accepted this satanic narrations because it was in the hadith, because they considered it sahih, later ones today, they say no, it's not authentic. It goes against their new theology that the prophet is infallible when it comes to the revelations. Now, someone who doesn't accept any hadith as a source of religious law, I put no weight whatsoever on these narrations that the prophet received satanic verses. I see this as an insult to the Quran, that this is something that was fabricated by the enemies. But the challenge is Sunnis aren't abiding by their own doctrine. If they know that these chains are sahih by their standard, and by their standard they're considered mutawatir, yet they choose to openly defy them, it shows that this is not a science, that their theology can shift based on whoever their ulama, their scholars are. That has nothing to do with isnad or credibility. It's simply, hey, I don't like this, so we're not going to accept it. And there's an amazing episode on this on the Hadith Critic channel regarding the satanic verses and looking at the isnad and showing that, yes, some of these isnads are authentic, and showing this shift on how the early Muslims accepted this narration and saw it in line with the Quran, and later Muslims rejected it and saw it out of line with the Quran. So let's look at some other examples of things that they consider to be mutawatir, yet they still dispute or they reject. So the Surah Fatiha is considered mutawatir, right? This is the opening surah of the Quran. It's what's recited in every unit of the contact prayer. Yet the Sunnis dispute regarding the first verse of the Fatiha. So among the four madhabs of Sunni Islam, the Malikis don't believe that Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is a verse of the Quran and not a verse of the Fatiha. So when they go to recite the Fatiha, they go straight to Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, and they omit this first verse. Then you have individuals like the Shafis who say, no, this is a verse of the Quran and it needs to be recited. And then you'll have individuals like the Hanbalis and the Hanafis who might say it quietly. So they can't even tell you that this, mutawatir surah of the Quran, the most recited surah of the Quran, they can't tell you if the Bismillah is part of it or not. Another funny example of a mutawatir hadith that they openly defy is the concept of doing ablution or being required to do ablution after eating cooked food. And this is found in numerous hadith that are considered reliable with authentic chains of transmission. For instance, Habiba narrated that the Prophet said, perform ablution after eating anything cooked with fire. Despite it being deemed as authentic, the practice is largely disregarded in contemporary Islamic observance. The primary reason is that scholars have determined the ruling to be abrogated, meaning it was applicable during early period of Islam, but later superseded by subsequent teachings. Despite no hadith existing where the Prophet is to have claimed this practice being abrogated, let alone what this hadith requirement even entailed. The fact there are so many contradictory hadith where the Prophet and his companions would eat cooked food and proceed to pray without performing a new ablution left many scholars just to presume that this ruling was abrogated. So it's like, hey, we got this weird hadith. It's telling us that we have to do ablution after we eat cooked food. What kind of food? And you see, there's all this hadith about, okay, well, he ate a shank of lamb. He didn't do ablution. Oh, he ate a camel. He did do ablution. Just nonsense. That they said, okay, look, we can't make heads or tails from this, so it must have been abrogated, even though they don't have any documentation saying that this ruling was abrogated. So they realize that their hadith sciences bring them to a dead end, and then they just say, okay, well, it must have been abrogated. Then there's other scholars who try to say that, oh, this form of ablution that it's referencing isn't the ablution we do before we do our salat. This is just meaning that you have to wash your mouth and hands after you eat for cleanliness purposes. So they're just trying to find some justification for something. So mutawatir, A, it's not being acted upon, and then B, it's not even being properly understood. So this is not certainty. It's the opposite of certainty. It's conjecture. In addition to this, we have examples of Ibn Taymiyyah, who had a lot of the hadith that were considered mutawatir that he was against regarding the visitation of the Prophet's grave or his intercession. And same thing with Abdul Wahhab, where he rejected a lot of the hadith that were deemed, mutawatir by Suyuti and others, because he says it goes against the core principles of the Quran. So now the question is, does it mean that, hey, because we have a lot of isnads for a hadith, that this is somehow proves that it's true? The scholar Ahmad al-Gumari, he offers a critique on how relying on isnad analysis to establish tawatur highlights a fundamental flaw in the argument that mass transmission automatically equates to certainty. He addresses the hadith, and this is the hadith, is seeking knowledge is obligatory on every Muslim, which has been classified by different scholars as mutawatir, sahih, hasan, or even da'if. The fact that a single hadith can be graded as so differently exposes the inherent subjectivity and inconsistency in utilizing isnad analysis to, one, establish tawatur, and two, to establish truth. So it reads, the claim that it is of the sort of tawatur that yields certain knowledge is sloppiness, far removed from the truth and rectitude, for you have seen what most of its isnad contains by ways of liars, for whom the easiest of crimes and most handy attack and affront on the hadith is to steal the matan and fabricate other isnads for them, is to increase their paths with the goal of appearing original and to draw attention to themselves. So the existence of isnad containing the like of these individuals does not yield tawatur, contrary to the isnad of trustworthy and decent narrators, of whom even only a small number may suffice for a tawatur of a hadith. So he's saying that the vast numbers of a hadith doesn't make it any more trustworthy or any more honest, especially when people are able to categorize that hadith, that statement, as mutawatir, sahih, hasan, and da'if. Ironically, Muslims who rely on mutawatir hadith as an unquestionable standard of truth face a dilemma when debating with Christians who apply the same reasoning to their own religious traditions. Christians argue that the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus are mutawatir within their historical and theological framework, as these events were reported by numerous sources across different regions and generations. If tawatur alone guarantees authenticity, then Muslims would have to accept these Christian claims as well, something they fundamentally reject. This exposes a critical flaw. Tawatur does not ensure factual accuracy, but only widespread transmission. Just as Muslims dismiss Christian mutawatir claims as unreliable despite their mass transmission, it follows that the mere tawatur of a hadith does not guarantee its truth. All it means is a bunch of people narrated something that could be wrong. Additionally, Muslims who reject the authenticity of the Bible, claiming that the original scriptures were lost but still existed in some form in 7th century Arabia, face a contradiction when they simultaneously appeal to tawatur as a measure of authenticity in hadith. If mass transmission is sufficient proof of preservation and reliability, then by their own standard, the Bible, texts transmitted across centuries by countless scholars, scribes, and religious communities, should also be accepted as authentic. Yet, Sunni Muslims reject these scriptures, arguing that they have been altered or corrupted despite their extensive transmission history. This demonstrates that tawatur is not applied consistently, but rather selectively, depending on theological convenience. Just as Sunni Muslims dismiss the reliability of biblical texts despite their widespread transmission, it follows that they cannot appeal to tawatur alone as an absolute measure of authenticity. The assumption that mass transmission equates to truth has long shaped how people perceive and validate information. Yet history and modern examples repeatedly challenge this notion. Even within the framework of tawatur, where widespread transmission is held as the gold standard for certainty, cracks appear upon closer examination. The phenomenon of collective memory often reveals how mass agreement can reinforce inaccuracies rather than confirm truths. So let's assume that we do have a tawatur transmission. By no means does this mean that the information that's being conveyed is epistemologically certain or even true. And we can look at historical myths to see how widely accepted narratives can be fundamentally flawed. Take, for example, the legend of Prester John, a mythical Christian king whose kingdom was said to exist in the East. It was treated as an incontrovertible fact for centuries. Chronicles and oral traditions bolstered its legitimacy, spreading the tale across medieval Europe, only for it to be entirely discredited by later exploration. Similarly, the idea that Napoleon Bonaparte was unusually short, a misconception born from propaganda and measurement errors, persisted despite his average height for his time. These narratives, perpetuated by mass agreement, exemplify how even seemingly well-documented stories can crumble under scrutiny. Modern examples further illustrate the fragility of mass transmission as a maker of truth. Consider the widely repeated claim that the Great Wall of China is visible from space, a belief found in textbooks and media, yet consistently debunked by astronauts, or the enduring myth that humans only use 10% of their brains, popularized by movies and motivational books despite being thoroughly discredited by neuroscience. Such misconceptions thrive because they are repeated often enough to create a veneer of certainty, even when the evidence contradicts them. The phenomenon known as the Mandela effect amplifies this issue, demonstrating how collective memory can reinforce falsehoods. For instance, if you ask the average person to recall the symbol of the Monopoly Man, they will recall him wearing a monocle, though he never had one. Similarly, the beloved children's series, The Berenstain Bears, is frequently misremembered as the Berenstain Bears, leading to widespread debates over its true spelling. These modern myths echo historical misconceptions, underscoring how collective belief, no matter how widespread, does not guarantee objective truth. When viewed through this lens, the claim that mutawatir hadith constitutes epistemological certainty becomes more tenuous. While the sheer number of transmitters lends weight to a tradition, history and collective memory repeatedly show that mass agreement can codify errors rather than dispel them. Whether in historical myths, modern misconceptions, or even religious debates, the confidence of the many cannot replace the rigor of critical examination. Tawatur may serve as a valuable tool for assessing reliability, but it falls short of offering an infallible guarantee of truth. This is because many people can converge upon a lie. As we saw, the concept of mutawatir hadith, often held as the ultimate standard of authenticity within Sunni Islam, unravels upon closer scrutiny. Firstly, no hadith genuinely meets the classification definition of tawatur. As early scholars acknowledge the impossibility of achieving the vast and geographically dispersed transmission required. To compensate, scholars introduced watered-down standards to classify certain hadith as mutawatir. Yet these revised definitions only deepen disputes, with scholars disagreeing on the proper thresholds and criteria, leading to divergent classifications and further fracturing of the consensus. Even when certain hadiths were labeled as mutawatir, their acceptance was far from universal. Prominent traditions that were considered mass transmitted by Sunni standards, like that of the Satanic verses, were denounced by later scholars who found the narrative conflicting with the revised doctrines. Additionally, schools disputed basic mass transmitted facts regarding the Quran and Salat, showing that their mass transmitted hadith did not provide the certainty they were expecting. Lastly, figures such as Ibn Taymiyyah and Abdul Wahhab rejected some mutawatir hadith and traditions based on theological grounds, arguing that the content conflicted with foundational principles like Tawhid. These debates illustrates that tawatur does not guarantee unassailable certainty, as traditions deemed universally transmitted were still contested within Sunni scholarship. Furthermore, historical and modern examples further highlight the fallibility of mass transmission as a marker of truth. From the enduring myths like Prester John and Napoleon's supposed short stature to modern phenomena like the Mandela effect and widespread misconceptions about historical and scientific facts, it becomes evident that collective belief often reinforces falsehoods rather than uncovering objective truths. Ultimately, even if one grants the existence of mutawatir hadith, such hadith cannot escape the limitations inherent in human memory, interpretation, and transmission. Moreover, the notion that tawatur equates to epistemological certainty is undermined by historical precedent and scholarly dissent, reminding us that even the most widespread agreements can still be false. So this whole claim of utilizing supposed mutawatir hadith fails on so many grounds. It has no foundation, there are no hadith that are genuinely mutawatir, and even if you grant them that, it doesn't mean that what is being stated is truthful. So for all these reasons, this argument is null and void. God willing, we're going to end there. If you guys want to get in contact, you can join us on our Discord server. We have a lively group of thousands of members, daily discussions, Quran recitations, and debates. It's a great place to converse with like-minded individuals. You can find the invite link for Discord below. We didn't talk about much of the verses of the Quran this time. It was more of the concept of mutawatir. But if you want to get a deeper understanding of the Quran, you can download the Quran Study app on the iOS App Store. If you don't have a device, you can go to QuranStudyApp.com website. It's a great place to understand and learn about the Quran. If you want today's discussion or notes on articles on various other topics, you can go to QuranTalkBlog.com website. And if you regular updates, fun memes and whatnot, you can follow me on X or Twitter at Talk Quran. And until next, and God bless.